They called it the greatest empire in history, but behind the crowns and castles lay hunger, chains and betrayal. While London's streets glittered with wealth, millions in India starved as grain was shipped away. In Africa, borders were slashed into maps with no mercy for the people who lived there. In the Caribbean, sugar sweetened British tea, but it was harvested by enslaved hands, broken bodies and stolen lives. This wasn't just empire, it was a machine built on suffering, and that is the truth they never wanted you to hear. But here's the truth no school book ever told you. Behind this polished image lies a shadow woven from blood, exploitation and scandal. Britain's story, often celebrated as the rise of a great empire, is also one of silence. Silence about those who suffered, those who starved, and those whose voices were deliberately erased to maintain the myth of glory. Think about it. Empires don't expand peacefully. They don't simply plant flags on new lands with polite handshakes. They expand through force, through violence, through taking what isn't theirs. And Britain, often praised as the empire on which the sun never set, was built not on sunshine but on broken lives. But here's the genius and the cruelty. At home, the British people were fed a different story. Newspapers painted conquests as heroic adventures. Children grew up learning songs about noble explorers and brave soldiers. Monuments and statues glorified generals who spilled rivers of blood abroad. The public was trained to see empire not as theft, but as destiny. Imagine living in London in the 1800s. You'd walk past grand buildings financed by colonial wealth, railways, banks, universities. You'd see sugar from the Caribbean on your table, tea from India steaming in your cup, cotton from Africa sewn into your clothes. Every comfort whispered of progress. Yet rarely would anyone pause to ask, at what cost? Who suffered for me to have this? The truth was buried, sanitized, and carefully hidden. Instead of famine, you heard about administration. Instead of massacre, you heard about revolt suppression. Instead of slavery, you heard about trade. Words were chosen to mask reality, to transform atrocities into achievements. And the monarchy, oh, the monarchy became the perfect shield. While scandals swirled behind palace walls, the royal family was presented as a symbol of morality, order, and unity. The crown wasn't just jewelry, it was a mask, designed to distract the public from the darker truths that lay beneath the surface. Here's the shocking part. Even today, much of this narrative survives. Museums proudly display treasures looted from across the world, but label them as gifts. School curriculums skim over colonial brutality, instead focusing on Britain's civilizing mission. The story of empire is told as one of progress, not pain. But history has a way of whispering the truth to those willing to listen. The voices of the silenced are still out there, in diaries, in oral traditions, in the ruins left behind. And once you hear them, you can't unhear them. Because behind the pomp and ceremony, behind the polished marble and royal processions, lies another Britain, a Britain of starving colonies, silenced dissent, secret scandals, and carefully orchestrated lies. And the deeper we go, the darker it becomes. Picture this: the Union Jack, rising over distant lands, soldiers marching with drums beating, and officials declaring Britain's rule as a gift of civilization. That's the story Britain sold to the world. But peel back the polished narrative, and you'll find the real cost: an empire dripping with blood. The British Empire wasn't just the largest in history, it was also one of the most ruthless. At its height, it controlled nearly a quarter of the planet's land and people. But empires don't grow this vast by kindness. They grow by conquest, exploitation, and domination. For every palace built in London, there were villages burned abroad. For every bank that prospered in Britain, there were millions enslaved by debt and poverty in the colonies. Take India, for example. By the 1700s, India was a wealthy land, rich with spices, textiles, and knowledge. But once Britain tightened its grip through the East India Company, that wealth flowed one way out: Indian artisans who had thrived for centuries were suddenly ruined as British imports flooded their markets. The famous Indian textiles, once prized worldwide, were deliberately destroyed so that British mills could dominate. Generations of families were pushed into poverty, not because of misfortune, but because of design, and India wasn't alone. In Africa, British companies carved up entire regions, taking gold, diamonds, and labor. The people living there didn't benefit from this progress. They were forced into brutal work, often beaten or killed for resisting. Resources were extracted like lifeblood, leaving behind scars that still run deep today. Even in places where Britain claimed to bring law and order, the reality was fear. In Kenya, when people rose up against colonial rule in the 1950s, the British responded with torture camps, beatings, and executions. The official story called it counterinsurgency. The truth, systematic brutality meant to crush resistance and keep power. And yet at home, the story was different. In London, the empire was painted as a benevolent force: railways, schools, and development. But who were those railways built for? Not the colonized. They were built to transport resources out more efficiently. Schools? They were designed to produce clerks who served the empire, not thinkers who could challenge it. Here's the cruel irony. The colonies paid for their own chains. Taxes collected from conquered lands often went straight into funding the very administration that oppressed them. Colonies weren't just robbed of wealth. They were forced to finance their own exploitation. Think about the emotional cost, too. Entire cultures were disrupted. Local languages pushed aside. Traditions dismissed as backward. People were made to feel ashamed of their identity, taught that their history only began when Britain arrived. That's not progress. That's erasure. And yet, when we hear about the British Empire today, we often hear nostalgia, the good old days of global power. But good for who? For the millions who starved, labored, and died under colonial rule. Those days were anything but golden. This is the truth hidden behind the grandeur of empire. Its foundations weren't built on glory. They were built on stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen lives. But if you think that's the darkest part, you're wrong. Because while empire drained nations dry, there were moments so horrific, so devastating, that even Britain couldn't fully hide them. One of the most haunting examples, India's famines. Tragedies that, if the British Empire had a crown jewel, it was India. Rich in resources, culture, and trade, it was the land that fueled Britain's rise as a global superpower. But here's the scandal. While Britain grew wealthy, millions of Indians paid the price with hunger, humiliation, and death. At first glance, Britain's presence in India was wrapped in words like progress, modernization, and order. Railways stretched across the subcontinent, ports expanded, and laws were rewritten. But dig deeper, and you'll see the cruel design. Every railway track, every tax law, every export policy was crafted, not for India's benefit, but to funnel its wealth into Britain's pockets. Let's start with money. Before colonization, India's share of the world economy was around 23. By the time Britain left in 1947, it had shrunk to barely 4. Why? Because resources poured out of India while poverty poured in. Taxes were crushing, local industries were strangled, and trade policies made sure Indian farmers and artisans couldn't compete with British goods. But the darkest scandal wasn't just economic theft. It was famine. Over and over, millions of Indians starved while British ships carried food out of the country. Take the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. Up to 10 million people died, nearly a third of Bengal's population. And yet, grain exports continued. Later in the late 19th century, during another series of famines, millions more perished. Why? Because British officials insisted on free market principles, forbidding local relief and prioritizing exports. The most infamous case came during World War II, the Bengal Famine of 1943. Fields were full, but food was diverted to feed Britain's war machine. As hunger spread, Winston Churchill, instead of sending aid, coldly remarked that the famine was India's fault for breeding like rabbits. Nearly 3 million people died while ships of rice left Bengal's shores. Imagine mothers holding starving children while supplies sat locked away in warehouses, untouchable. But famine wasn't just about food. It was about control. Hungry people are desperate people, easier to silence, easier to rule. By allowing starvation, Britain kept resistance weak and society fractured. And all the while, back in Britain, citizens sipped Indian tea and sweetened it with Caribbean sugar, never realizing the human suffering behind every cup. And then there was the looting, treasures taken under the guise of gifts. The Kohinoor diamond, one of the world's most famous gems, was seized from a child ruler and now sits in the crown jewels. Countless manuscripts, statues and artifacts were shipped to British museums. To this day, India's cultural heritage lies behind glass cases in London, labelled as part of world history, with no mention of the theft that brought them there. But perhaps the deepest wound was psychological. Generations were told that their own traditions, languages and systems of knowledge were inferior. English became the language of power, while local dialects were shamed. Ancient Indian medicine, science and philosophy were dismissed, even ridiculed, while British schools taught Indian children to admire the very empire that oppressed them. Imagine growing up in your homeland, but being told it wasn't truly yours. Imagine watching your parents starve, while grain shipments left your port. Imagine being educated in a system that convinced you your history began only when Britain arrived. That was the scandal of India under empire. Not just theft of wealth, but theft of dignity, memory and humanity. And yet India wasn't the only neighbor to feel the sharp edge of Britain's rule. Across the sea, another land suffered silently, a land where famine and oppression also became tools of empire. When we talk about the British Empire, the focus often shifts to faraway colonies, India, Africa, the Caribbean. But one of the earliest and most tragic examples of exploitation happened much closer to home, Ireland. A land of poets, farmers, and deep traditions, Ireland became a testing ground for Britain's methods of domination, and its scars remain to this day. At first glance, Ireland was seen as Britain's backyard colony, conquered piece by piece from the 12th century onward. It became a land where the majority of Irish Catholics were stripped of rights, forced off their lands, and made tenants under wealthy English landlords. Imagine working the soil your family had tilled for generations, only to pay rent to an absentee landlord, living in London, never setting foot on the fields that gave him wealth. That was the Irish reality. But the most haunting chapter came in the 19th century, and Gort Amor, the Great Famine. Between 1845 and 1852, a potato blight swept across Ireland, destroying the crop that most poor families depended on for survival. But here's the scandal. While 1 million Irish men, women and children starved to death, ships filled with wheat, beef and butter left Irish ports bound for England. Food wasn't absent. It was exported. The famine wasn't simply a natural disaster. It was political. British officials clung to free market policies, refusing to intervene with food relief. Some even saw the famine as a cruel opportunity, a way to reduce the Irish population and break resistance. Charles Trevelyan, a British administrator, famously described the famine as the judgment of God on the Irish people, blaming them for their own suffering. Can you imagine watching your children waste away while officials told you starvation was divine punishment? The numbers are staggering. 1 million dead, another million forced to emigrate, packed into coffin ships, headed for America or Canada. Families torn apart, villages emptied, a culture pushed to the brink of collapse. Entire generations of Irish identity were scattered across the globe, not by choice but by desperation. And yet, back in Britain, the story was softened. Newspapers spoke of a tragic blight, rarely mentioning the policies that turned hunger into mass death. The Irish were painted as lazy, incapable, even deserving of their fate, stereotypes that excused Britain from responsibility. But the famine was just one part of a much larger pattern. For centuries, Irish Catholics were denied the right to vote, barred from certain jobs, and stripped of cultural expression. Speaking Irish Gaelic was discouraged, even punished in schools. Songs, language, traditions, all suppressed in the name of civilization. Think about the emotional toll. Imagine being told your very identity was inferior. Imagine walking through silent fields where entire villages once stood, the echoes of laughter replaced by hunger and grief. The trauma wasn't just physical, it was generational, and the effects didn't vanish with time. The famine left a deep bitterness, fueling centuries of resistance, rebellion, and eventually Ireland's long, painful fight for independence. To this day, the memory of that suffering shapes Irish identity, passed down in stories and songs, a reminder of what was endured. But here's what's rarely said. Ireland's story wasn't unique. The methods tested there, exploitation of land, suppression of culture, reliance on famine and poverty to control populations, became a blueprint for how Britain ruled elsewhere. What began in Ireland echoed across the empire, and just as Ireland's hunger was dismissed, so too were the cries of millions across. When you think of empire, you might imagine soldiers, flags, and battles over land. But the British Empire fought one of its most infamous wars, not for territory, not for honor, but for drugs. And the victims, millions of ordinary Chinese people, whose lives were shattered so Britain could keep its trade profits flowing. The story begins in the late 1700s. Britain had an obsession with Chinese goods. Tea, silk, porcelain. Demand was so high that ships sailed endlessly from Canton to London, carrying luxuries that became staples of British life. But there was a problem. China didn't want much from Britain in return. The trade imbalance drained British silver reserves, threatening the empire's wealth. The solution Britain found was as cold as it was cruel: opium. Grown in British-controlled India, this addictive drug became the empire's weapon. British merchants began flooding China with opium, hooking millions on a substance that destroyed families, communities, and stability. Imagine a government knowingly pushing a deadly addiction on another nation, not in secret, but openly, backed by warships and guns. By the early 1800s, addiction in China was rampant. Farmers sold their tools, fathers abandoned families, officials themselves were hooked. The social fabric of China was unraveling. Finally, the Chinese emperor said enough was enough. He banned opium and ordered shipments destroyed. And what was Britain's response? Outrage. Not because of morality, but because their profits were threatened. In 1839, when Chinese officials seized and burned opium stocks in Canton, Britain declared war. They called it a matter of free trade. But let's be clear, this was about forcing a nation to accept poison. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, revealed the brutal imbalance of power. Britain's modern navy crushed China's defenses. Cities were bombarded, civilians suffered, and eventually China was forced into a humiliating treaty. The Treaty of Nanking not only legalized the opium trade, but also handed Hong Kong to Britain. A war fought over drugs ended with land, ports, and power changing hands. But it didn't end there. Resistance continued, and Britain came back for more in the Second Opium War, 1856-1860. Once again, warships, cannons, and soldiers rained destruction, all to secure the right to profit from addiction. By the end, China was carved open to foreign influence, its sovereignty shattered, its people left to bear the cost. Think about the human toll: families destroyed by addiction, farmers forced to grow opium instead of food, communities collapsing under the weight of dependency. This wasn't just economic exploitation, it was social sabotage on a national scale. And yet in Britain, the wars were celebrated as victories of commerce and civilization. The hypocrisy is staggering. At home, Britain condemned addiction, policing its own streets against drugs. Abroad, it became the world's biggest dealer, and the profits? They poured back into the empire, funding banks, railways, and even the very institutions that would later present Britain as a beacon of morality. Even today, the legacy remains. The Opium Wars marked the beginning of what China calls the century of humiliation, a period of foreign domination and internal weakness. A century triggered not by Chinese weakness, but by Britain's greed. And here's the chilling part. This wasn't an isolated scandal. It was part of a pattern. Time and again, Britain proved it would sacrifice morality, human dignity, and entire nations for wealth. If opium could be weaponized, so too could human beings themselves. When most people think of Britain and slavery, they remember the abolitionists, noble figures like William Wilberforce, who campaigned to end the slave trade. Schools often highlight Britain's role in ending slavery, but what's often hidden, downplayed, or glossed over is that for centuries before abolition, Britain was one of the biggest slave-trading powers in the world. The empire's prosperity, its banks, its industries, even its stately homes, they were all built on the backs of enslaved Africans. Let's go back to the 1600s. Britain was hungry to expand, to dominate the seas, and to control trade routes. Sugar from the Caribbean, cotton from the Americas, tobacco for Europe. These commodities were in massive demand. But plantations needed labor, and not just any labor. They needed workers who could be controlled, dehumanized, and treated as property. The answer, in Britain's eyes, was the Atlantic slave trade. British ships would leave ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and London loaded with guns, textiles, and manufactured goods. They sailed to Africa, where these goods were exchanged for human lives. Men, women, and children captured, chained, and forced aboard. The ships then crossed the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage. Conditions were horrific. Imagine being shackled below deck, crammed so tightly you could barely move, surrounded by the stench of disease and death. Thousands didn't survive the journey, their bodies thrown into the ocean like cargo that had spoiled. Those who did survive arrived in the Caribbean or the Americas, where they were sold like animals at auction, families torn apart, names erased, identities stripped away. For the empire, these weren't people, they were profits. Enslaved Africans became the invisible engine of Britain's wealth. Plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, and other colonies generated immense riches. Sugar, in particular, became Britain's white gold, sweetening tea in drawing rooms and fueling a consumer revolution back home. But behind every spoonful of sugar was the sweat, blood, and suffering of enslaved Africans. And the profits didn't just stay on the plantations. They flowed back into Britain, where they built empires of another kind: banks, shipping companies, universities, and even the cultural institutions that still stand today. The great wealth of cities like Liverpool and Bristol was directly tied to slavery. The aristocracy invested heavily, and many of the grand estates of Britain's elite were financed by this trade in human lives. Here's the dark irony. While Britain grew rich off slavery, it also cultivated an image of moral superiority. Later, when abolition came in 1807 for the trade, and 1833 for slavery itself, Britain presented itself as a global leader in human rights. But the truth is murkier. Abolition wasn't only about morality, it was about economics. The Industrial Revolution was rising, and the empire no longer needed slavery in the same way. Machines, factories, and wage labor were taking over. And here's another scandal they rarely mention. When Britain abolished slavery in its colonies, it didn't compensate the enslaved. Instead, it compensated the slave owners. The British government paid out the modern equivalent of billions of pounds to former slaveholders for the loss of their property. That debt was so huge that British taxpayers only finished paying it off in 2015. Think about that. Until less than a decade ago, ordinary people were still funding reparations, not to the descendants of the enslaved, but to those who once owned them. The enslaved, meanwhile, were left with nothing but freedom in name. Many continued to work on plantations under brutal conditions, locked in cycles of poverty and oppression. The scars of slavery didn't vanish in 1833. They echoed for generations, shaping inequality across the Caribbean and beyond. And yet, in the public memory of Britain, this chapter is often softened, hidden, or celebrated only through the lens of abolition. Statues glorify slave traders, streets still bear their names, and history books talk more about Wilberforce than about the millions of Africans who endured unimaginable suffering. The truth is, Britain was not just a participant in the slave trade, it was a leader. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, British ships transported an estimated 3.1 million Africans into slavery. That's not just a statistic. That's millions of stolen lives, generations destroyed, cultures uprooted, and the wealth. It became the foundation of the empire's power. Without slavery, Britain would not have industrialized as quickly, nor would its global dominance have been so absolute. This isn't just history. The legacies of slavery are still with us today in economic inequalities, in racial tensions, and in the very structures of power that slavery helped build. Britain's dark secret is not simply that it profited from slavery, but that it built an empire on it, then rewrote the story to paint itself as the hero. For centuries, the British monarchy has been wrapped in a golden glow. Kings and queens paraded as symbols of unity, stability, and tradition. Crowns glitter, ceremonies dazzle, and portraits hang in gilded frames, all carefully curated to project majesty. But behind that carefully polished image lies a history of secrets, scandals, and cover-ups that reveal a very different reality. The monarchy's power wasn't just ceremonial in its early days of empire. Royals were deeply tied to conquest and exploitation. Queen Elizabeth I herself granted charters to explorers and merchants who kick-started Britain's involvement in slavery and colonial expansion. These weren't distant events, they were royal ventures, backed by the crown. The monarchy profited directly from empire, trade, and the suffering of others, all while presenting itself as the guardian of a noble, civilized mission. As centuries passed, the monarchy became less politically powerful and more symbolic. But that symbolism was carefully managed. Scandals were buried, truths hidden, and reputations protected at all costs. The Victorian age, often painted as a period of moral uprightness, offers plenty of examples. Queen Victoria herself became a symbol of stability and morality, yet her empire was fueled by wars, famine, and colonial exploitation. The image of a devoted widow in black mourning dress masked an empire built on blood. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the cracks in the royal facade began to show. Edward VIII, for instance, abdicated in 1936, not simply for love, as the official story goes, but because his relationship with Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, threatened the monarchy's carefully crafted image. Behind closed doors, Edward's political sympathies were troubling too. Evidence suggests he had Nazi leanings, a fact deliberately buried for decades. Then came Princess Margaret's scandals, Prince Charles and Diana's turbulent marriage, and the infamous royal affairs that tabloids feasted on. These were not just private matters. They revealed how desperate the monarchy was to maintain a perfect image, even as real human struggles unraveled behind palace walls. Diana's story in particular shattered illusion. The fairy tale princess image collapsed into a tale of loneliness, betrayal, and tragedy that the world watched unfold. Her death in 1997 didn't just cause grief, it caused outrage. For many, it exposed how cold and detached the monarchy could be when faced with the suffering of one of its own. But scandals weren't limited to personal lives. There have always been questions about royal wealth and privilege. Much of the monarchy's fortune is rooted in colonial extraction and investments tied to empire. Lands seized abroad, treasures taken, and profits from trade enriched the crown, while ordinary people, both in Britain and in the colonies, labored under hardship. Even today, the crown jewels include gems with bloody histories, like the Kohinoor diamond from India, seen by many as a symbol of colonial theft. And then, of course, there are the more modern scandals. Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein, the accusations of abuse, and the royal family's attempts to silence or downplay the story revealed once again a pattern: protect the institution at all costs, no matter the truth. Public trust wavered, and the once sacred image of untouchable royalty was cracked. The monarchy's survival depends on its ability to appear above politics, above scandal, and above the ordinary struggles of people. But history shows that this image is an illusion. The monarchy is as human and as flawed as any other institution. It has hidden its mistakes, rewritten its history, and polished its image for centuries. So why does this matter? Because the monarchy isn't just a family. It's a symbol, and symbols carry power. The gap between the royal image and the royal reality reveals how power itself works. Polished on the surface, messy and secret beneath. And yet, despite every scandal, every cover-up, every exposure, the monarchy survives. It adapts, reinvents itself, and continues to command fascination. Perhaps that's its greatest secret of all. Not perfection, but resilience. When people imagine Victorian Britain, they often picture cobblestone streets, gas lamps glowing in the fog, and women in elegant gowns strolling beside gentlemen in top hats. It's the romanticized image of novels and period dramas. But the reality of Victorian society was far darker. Behind the lace curtains and royal pageantry, the empire's foundations were riddled with cruelty, exploitation, and crimes that were carefully concealed from polite society. The Victorian Age, spanning Queen Victoria's reign from 1837 to 1901, was celebrated as a time of progress. Railways stretched across the land, factories multiplied, and science made astonishing leaps. But that progress came at a staggering cost. For the working poor, Victorian Britain was a nightmare of endless labor, disease, and poverty. Families crammed into tiny, damp tenements, where cholera and tuberculosis spread like wildfire. Children as young as 5 were sent to work in coal mines, crawling through narrow shafts for 12-hour shifts in near darkness. Others toiled in textile mills, their small fingers better suited for fixing machinery, until accidents mangled them. These horrors were not accidents of the system. They were the system. The empire ran on cheap labor, and human suffering was simply the price of progress. Meanwhile, the empire's wealth poured in from colonies overseas, often through violence. India, for instance, was both jewel and prison. After the British East India Company's brutal rule gave way to direct crown control in 1858, famine became a recurring tragedy. Grain was exported to Britain even as millions starved. In the Great Famine of 1876-1878, as many as 5 million Indians perished, while the empire boasted of prosperity. These deaths weren't acts of nature. They were the result of imperial policy. At home, the Victorian elite worked tirelessly to maintain their reputation for morality. Queen Victoria herself was hailed as the embodiment of virtue, loyal, modest, devoted to family. But her reign oversaw some of the most shocking hypocrisies in British history. While she mourned her husband in black for 40 years, countless women across her empire had their lives dictated by a moral code they had no say in, often punished for transgressions men openly committed. Prostitution in London became rampant, fueled in part by the very soldiers and officials tasked with upholding honor. The state's answer, the Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed police to arrest women suspected of prostitution and subject them to invasive medical exams, while the men who paid for their services walked away untouched. And then there was crime, not just on the streets, but in high society itself. The Victorian obsession with appearances meant scandals were often buried. Jack the Ripper's murders in Whitechapel drew sensational headlines, but countless other crimes against the poor were ignored. The public devoured lurid tales of depravity while conveniently overlooking the everyday violence of poverty, hunger, and neglect. Even more unsettling, whispers suggested the Ripper himself might have had ties to the upper classes, a theory fueled by the police's suspiciously ineffective investigation. The empire also turned its crimes into spectacle. Human beings from colonized lands were displayed in human zoos at exhibitions, forced to live in staged villages for the entertainment of gawking crowds. The 1851 Great Exhibition, hailed as a triumph of British progress, showcased treasures looted from around the world alongside these demeaning displays. What was called education was in truth exploitation, with Britain's dominance paraded like a trophy. Even in science and medicine, the Victorian age carried dark secrets. Experiments on the poor, the mentally ill, and colonial subjects were often conducted without consent. The very idea of race science flourished under Victorian thinkers, providing intellectual cover for empire. Skulls were measured, charts drawn, and entire peoples labeled inferior to justify domination. These weren't fringe ideas, they were mainstream, shaping policy and culture alike. And yet, through it all, the Victorian machine of image-making never stopped. Literature, art, and architecture projected grandeur. The monarchy stood as a symbol of stability and virtue. The poor were told to be grateful, the colonized to be loyal, and the public to look away from the shadows. The crimes of the Victorian age weren't only the murders in dark alleys or the scandals whispered behind closed doors. They were systemic, embedded in industry, empire, and ideology. And the most chilling part is how effectively they were hidden behind the polished veneer of Victorian respectability. So the next time you see the grandeur of Victorian Britain, remember, beneath the gaslight and the glitter, there was blood on the cobblestones, and silence covering screams the world was never meant to hear. When we think of the British Empire, the numbers alone are staggering. At its height, it controlled a quarter of the world's land and ruled over 400 million people. Maps of the time painted vast swathes of the globe in red, proudly declaring, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." But behind this triumphalist image lay a machine built on exploitation, a system that drained wealth from colonies while silencing the very people who paid its price. Take India, the so-called jewel in the crown. For 2 centuries it was treated as Britain's private treasure chest. Raw materials flowed out, cotton, tea, spices, opium, while finished goods flowed back in, destroying local industries. Skilled Indian weavers, once renowned worldwide, saw their livelihoods vanish as British textiles flooded the market. Entire economies were bent to Britain's will, ensuring profit for the empire and poverty for the colonies. By some estimates, Britain extracted trillions in today's value from India alone. That wealth built railways, banks, and grand buildings back in London, while villages in India sank deeper into starvation. And starvation wasn't rare, it was engineered. Famine swept across India under colonial rule, with tens of millions dying. Yet even as fields dried and bellies swelled from hunger, trains carried grain out of India to feed British markets. Colonial officials often blamed laziness or overpopulation, while in reality policies of forced export and neglect were at fault. The silence in Britain about these deaths wasn't accidental. Newspapers downplayed them, politicians dismissed them, and the public was fed a narrative of benevolent rule. Africa, too, was carved up like a pie at the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, with Britain taking massive slices. The colonies were marketed as sources of endless resources, gold, diamonds, rubber, cocoa, and their people as expendable labor. In Kenya, fertile land was seized for white settlers, while local communities were forced into labor camps. In South Africa, Britain's hunger for diamonds and gold fueled brutal wars and racial segregation that laid the foundations for apartheid. And yet at home, these acts were framed as civilizing missions, with empire portrayed as a gift to the colonized. But exploitation wasn't just economic, it was cultural, psychological, and deeply personal. Children in colonies were forced into missionary schools, where their languages were beaten out of them, their histories erased, and their identities rewritten. Generations grew up believing their heritage was inferior, that their value lay only in serving the empire. This wasn't just conquest of land, it was conquest of the mind. Meanwhile, the silence back home was deafening. Ordinary British citizens rarely saw the whip marks on African backs or the hollow cheeks of starving Indian children. They saw tea in their cups, sugar in their bowls, and cotton in their clothes, comforts bought at unimaginable cost. When dissenters spoke up, whether Indian nationalists, African leaders, or even a few British critics, they were dismissed as radicals, censored, or jailed. The empire maintained its image not just through force abroad, but through silence at home. What makes this even darker is how the empire celebrated itself. Colonial exhibitions displayed looted treasures alongside exotic performers from colonies, turning human suffering into entertainment. The Great Exhibition of 1851, for example, showcased riches from across the empire in London's Crystal Palace, inviting visitors to marvel at Britain's global dominance. Few asked how those treasures were obtained, or whose lives had been destroyed to acquire them. The colonial machine was efficient, ruthless, and systematic. It extracted wealth, erased cultures, and silenced dissent, all while convincing ordinary Britons that they were part of a noble mission. And in many ways, it worked. For generations, the crimes of empire were hidden beneath layers of pride and propaganda. But peel back those layers, and the truth is clear: the empire's greatness was built on the suffering of others. And while Britain celebrated progress, millions across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean lived with chains, some literal, others invisible. The British monarchy has always been wrapped in a cloak of grandeur, golden carriages, glittering crowns, and carefully orchestrated pageantry. To the public, the royals symbolized stability, morality, and continuity. But behind palace walls, the story was often very different. Beneath the polished image lay scandals, secrets, and cover-ups the palace worked tirelessly to conceal. Let's start with Queen Victoria, the monarch who defined an entire era of supposed morality. After her husband Prince Albert's death, she retreated from public life, draping herself in mourning black for decades. But whispers spread about her close relationship with John Brown, a Scottish servant. Court insiders gossiped that Victoria relied on Brown, not only as a confidant, but perhaps as something more. Letters were destroyed, rumors suppressed, and official biographies rewritten to sanitize the story. The monarchy could not afford to be seen as scandalous, not when it was selling itself as the guardian of Victorian values. Then came King Edward VII, Victoria's son, nicknamed Dirty Bertie. His reputation for gambling, affairs, and indulgence was legendary. Long before he became king, he was caught in a scandal with an actress, which horrified his strict mother. Later, he was even dragged into the infamous Tranby Croft Baccarat scandal in 1890, where he was accused of participating in illegal gambling. Though acquitted, the case stained his image. Yet, once again, palace officials worked overtime to protect the crown's dignity, ensuring his indiscretions were framed as harmless eccentricities rather than shameful behavior. But perhaps the most explosive royal scandal of the Empire era was King Edward VIII's abdication in 1936. Edward fell in love with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The romance alone was enough to scandalize the establishment. But there was more. Behind closed doors, Edward's sympathies with Nazi Germany alarmed government officials. Some historians even suggest he was viewed as a potential liability, a king whose loyalties were questionable at best. The abdication was publicly explained as a sacrifice for love, but the truth was far murkier. Documents revealing the extent of his Nazi ties were buried for decades, hidden to preserve the monarchy's honor. Even in the 20th century, palace secrecy continued. The royal family presented itself as a model of duty, yet personal struggles were buried under layers of silence. Princess Margaret's love affair with Peter Townsend was squashed to protect tradition. Rumors swirled about Prince Philip's alleged affairs, though the palace never allowed such claims to see the light of day. The guiding principle was always the same: protect the crown, no matter what. The irony is stark. While the monarchy projected itself as the pinnacle of morality and restraint, its members were often entangled in the very scandals they condemned in others. Affairs, financial controversies, even questionable political ties, all were carefully hidden or rebranded. The public saw a fairy tale. Behind closed doors, it was often chaos, compromise, and cover-up. And here's the most chilling part. The palace had the machinery to make the truth disappear. Newspapers were pressured, archives were sealed, and inconvenient witnesses were silenced with money or influence. Scandals weren't denied, they were erased. This pattern tells us something crucial about empire itself. Just as the British state covered up atrocities abroad while boasting of civilization, the monarchy covered up its scandals while presenting itself as the moral heart of the nation. Image always came before truth. So the next time you see the crown glittering on television, remember, behind the jewels and the pomp lies a history of secrets the palace never wanted you to know. The British Empire didn't just conquer land. It conquered minds. It left scars that still shape our world today. One of its most powerful tools was division. Divide, rule, and profit. That was the formula. In India, the British fanned the flames between Hindus and Muslims. They played communities against each other. They drew lines, enforced differences, and nurtured distrust. When independence finally came in 1947, those seeds exploded into partition. Over 1 million dead, millions more displaced, families torn apart forever. In Africa, borders were drawn with rulers on maps. No thought for tribes, languages, or traditions. Communities that had lived side by side for centuries were split apart. Rivals were forced together. The result, conflict after conflict, long after the empire ended. In the Middle East, the story was the same. Promises made, promises broken. During World War I, Britain pledged independence to Arab leaders. At the same time, it secretly carved up the region with France. The Sykes-Picot Agreement drew artificial lines that still fuel wars today. Even religion was used as a weapon. Missionaries claimed to civilize, but their schools erased languages and identities. Generations were taught to feel ashamed of their roots. They were told British culture was superior, their own inferior. That damage didn't vanish with independence. It lingers. And what about economics? Colonies were forced into dependency, local industries destroyed, crops diverted for export. Even after the empire collapsed, many nations were left trapped, poor, unstable, reliant on trade systems designed by Britain. The empire's genius wasn't just in conquest, it was in control, not through brute force alone, but through invisible chains: identity, economy, politics. Chains that lasted long after the Union Jack was lowered. And here's the haunting truth. Britain presented itself as a teacher of democracy. Yet in its colonies, it silenced freedom movements, jailed leaders, and crushed uprisings. Those who dared to resist were branded traitors. Those who complied were rewarded. The legacy is everywhere, in fractured borders, in ethnic tensions, in weak economies, in the lingering shadow of division. Nations still struggle to heal from wounds the empire left behind. Britain may have withdrawn its soldiers, but the lines it drew, the divisions it deepened, the systems it built, they remain. Every empire tells a story of glory. But behind every triumph lies a graveyard. The British Empire was no different. Its victories came with hidden costs. Costs paid not by kings or lords, but by ordinary people whose names history rarely remembers. Let's start with the colonies. For centuries, wealth flowed into Britain: gold, cotton, sugar, tea, opium, but it didn't come free. It came soaked in sweat and blood. In India alone, famine after famine killed tens of millions while grain was shipped abroad. In Africa, entire generations were worked to exhaustion in mines and plantations. In the Caribbean, enslaved people produced the sugar that sweetened Britain's tea, their lives brutally shortened by violence and disease. And the numbers are staggering. Historians estimate Britain extracted trillions in today's value from its colonies. That money built railways, banks, universities, and palaces back home. But the people who paid the price were left in poverty, their lands stripped, their industries destroyed, their futures stolen. The cost wasn't just economic. It was cultural, languages erased, traditions mocked, spiritual beliefs suppressed. Whole histories rewritten to glorify the empire, while erasing indigenous voices. Imagine growing up being told your culture was backward, your identity worthless, your ancestors nothing but savages waiting to be saved. That wound doesn't heal easily. And then there was the emotional toll. Mothers forced to watch children taken for labor, fathers jailed for resisting unfair taxes, families torn apart by partition, famine, or war. For every British victory, there were countless broken homes in the colonies. Even ordinary Britons paid a price. The working poor at home lived in misery while elites grew rich off empire. Children in Manchester's factories, miners in Wales, dock workers in Liverpool. Their lives were just another cog in the imperial machine. The empire promised pride and progress, but most citizens saw little of its wealth. They got slogans, not security. Perhaps the greatest cost was trust. The empire made promises it never kept. Promises of protection, of prosperity, of partnership. In reality, it delivered control, exploitation, and betrayal. When independence finally came, nations were left divided, weakened and scarred. So who really paid for Britain's greatness? Not the royal family, not the politicians, not the merchants who grew rich. It was the enslaved, the colonized, the poor, the forgotten, those whose stories were silenced so Britons could shine. That's the final secret of the empire. Its glory was never free. It was borrowed, stolen from those who had no choice but to pay. And now the story is in your hands. If these hidden truths shocked you, if they made you see the empire not as glory but as grief, then don't let them fade into silence. Hit like, not for me but for the millions whose voices were erased. Hit subscribe, because history has many more secrets they never wanted you to know, and together we can uncover them. And drop a comment below. Which part of this story moved you the most? Your words keep their memory alive, because history isn't just about kings and crowns. It's about people. And when we remember those who were silenced, we finally begin to tell the full story.